Imagine you are a grain merchant in the port city of Constantinople. The year is 541 AD, and the city around you is the most magnificent on earth. 500,000 people live within its walls, a number so staggering that it will not be matched by any European city for nearly 1,000 years. The Hagia Sophia, completed just 4 years ago, still smells of fresh plaster and candle smoke. Its dome so vast and so perfectly proportioned that people say it hangs from heaven on a golden chain. The Emperor Justinian, ruling from his palace on the hill above the Bosphorus, is on the verge of something that no one has managed in over a century. He is on the verge of reuniting the Roman Empire. His generals have already retaken North Africa from the Vandals. Italy is falling back into imperial hands. Spain is next. The dream of a restored Rome, of a single empire stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia, is closer to reality than it has been since the empire's division a century and a half before. Justinian's lawyers are rewriting Roman law into a code so comprehensive that it will form the foundation of legal systems across Europe for the next 15 centuries. His architects are building, his generals are winning, his treasury is full. And then the ships arrive from Egypt. The sailors on those ships are dying. Some are already dead at their oars. The ones still alive are feverish, delirious, covered in swellings, the size of eggs that have turned black beneath the skin. Within weeks, Constantinople is burying 10,000 people a day. Within months, the most powerful empire in the Western world is on its knees. And within a decade, everything Justinian had built, everything he had dreamed, everything that Rome had almost become again, is gone. Before COVID, before the Black Death, before every pandemic that has reshaped human history, there was this one. To understand how completely the plague of Justinian shattered the ancient world, you first have to understand what that world looked like at its peak. The Byzantine Empire, which is what historians call the eastern half of the Roman Empire that survived the fall of the West, in 476 AD, was in 541 AD a civilization of breathtaking sophistication and ambition. Its capital, Constantinople, sat at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, controlling the narrow strait of the Bosphorus, through which nearly all trade between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean had to pass. It was fabulously wealthy, culturally vibrant, militarily powerful, and governed by a man who combined the administrative genius of the greatest Roman emperors with a personal vision so grand it bordered on megalomania. Justinian I had been born a peasant in what is now North Macedonia, the nephew of a soldier who had risen through the ranks to become emperor. He'd educated himself with ferocious intensity, mastered theology and law and military strategy, married a former actress named Theodora, who turned out to be one of the most formidable political minds of the age, and by 527 AD sat on the throne of the most powerful state in the Western world. His ambition was simple and total. He wanted to restore the Roman Empire to its former glory, and he was, against all reasonable expectation, actually doing it. His greatest general, Belisarius, had swept through North Africa in a campaign of stunning speed, destroying the Vandal kingdom that had held it for a century. Italy, the heartland of the old empire, was being painfully, expensively, but undeniably retaken from the Ostrogoths. The Mediterranean was beginning, just barely beginning, to look like a Roman lake again. and then the bacterium Yersinia pestis, carried in the gut of fleas living on the backs of black rats in the grain ships of Egypt, arrived in Constantinople and changed everything. But what you're about to hear is the part of this story that connects directly to every pandemic that has come since, because the mistakes that Justinian's empire made in 541 AD are the same mistakes that have been made again and again across 15 centuries of human history. The plague arrived in Constantinople in the spring of 541 AD, almost certainly carried by grain shipments from Egypt, which was the empire's primary breadbasket, and the hub through which goods from Africa, Arabia, and the Indian Ocean trade routes passed into the Mediterranean world. The first cases were reported in the port district. Within days, they had spread into the heart of the city. The historian Procopius, who was present in Constantinople during the outbreak, and left behind one of the most detailed eyewitness accounts of any ancient pandemic, described what he saw with a clinical precision that reads, across 15 centuries, like something from a modern medical journal. The disease began with a sudden fever, mild enough at first that many people assumed they were simply tired, simply overworked, and went about their days as normal, spreading the infection through every quarter of the city before they understood what was happening. Then came the swellings, in the groin, in the armpits, behind the ears, the lymph nodes swelling to the size of apples, hard and agonizing, turning dark beneath the skin as the infection overwhelmed the body's defenses. Some patients fell into deep, death-like sleep from which they could not be roused. Others were seized by violent hallucinations, seeing phantoms, convinced that strangers were trying to murder them, throwing themselves from windows and into the streets in their delirium. The mortality rate in Constantinople reached, at its peak, 10,000 deaths per day. 10,000 per day in a city of 500,000 people. Procopius describes the bodies piling up faster than the living could bury them. The emperor ordered the construction of mass graves outside the city walls, enormous pits into which the dead were stacked in layers. When those filled, the roofs of the great towers of the Galata fortifications were torn off, and the towers themselves filled with corpses, then sealed, the streets emptied. The markets closed. The harbour fell silent. Justinian himself fell ill. He survived, but the weeks of his illness were weeks in which the empire had no effective leadership, at precisely the moment it needed it most. And this is where the story stops being ancient history and starts being something you have lived through yourself, in a different form, in a different century. Because the response to the plague of Justinian followed a pattern that will feel, if you lived through 2020 and 2021, uncomfortably familiar. The initial denial, surely this is local, surely it will pass, surely the grain ships must keep running because the city must be fed. The overwhelmed medical system, Byzantine physicians, had no understanding of germ theory, no concept of contagion in the modern sense, and no effective treatment beyond prayer and the draining of the swellings, which helped almost no one. The economic collapse. Tax revenues collapsed as the population died. Merchants stopped trading. The military could not be paid. Campaigns that had been on the verge of victory had to be abandoned. And the misinformation. Even in 541 AD, even without social media, the misinformation spread as fast as the disease itself. Procopius and other contemporary writers record the theories that circulated through Constantinople as the dead piled up in the towers. God was punishing the empire for its sins, a theory promoted by certain clergy who saw in the catastrophe an opportunity for religious revival, and whose congregations swelled, even as, or perhaps because, the dying were desperate for meaning. Others blamed Justinian himself, claiming that the emperor was in league with demons, that he had brought this upon the empire through his impiety, or his ambition, or his persecution of various theological factions. Procopius, who disliked Justinian intensely, and wrote a secret history of his reign that he kept hidden during his lifetime, suggested with savage irony that perhaps Justinian was not in league with demons at all. Perhaps he simply was one. 15 centuries before Twitter, the conspiracy theories wrote themselves. But here is the revelation that modern science has added to this ancient story, and it is one that changes everything. For most of the 20th century, historians debated whether the plague of Justinian was truly bubonic plague, the same disease caused by Yersinia pestis that would return in the 14th century as the Black Death. The symptoms described by Procopius matched, but ancient descriptions are not always reliable. Then, in 2013, a team of researchers extracted ancient DNA from the teeth of plague victims buried in 6th century cemeteries in Bavaria, and the results were unambiguous. It was Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium. 8 centuries before the Black Death, the same pathogen had already found humanity once, burned through it and retreated, leaving behind a world so weakened and so changed that nothing would ever be quite the same again. The plague of Justinian did not end in 541 AD. It returned in waves for the next 2 centuries, erupting, retreating, erupting again, each time finding new populations with no immunity, each time leaving fewer people behind. Historians now estimate that across its full duration, the Justinianic plague may have killed between 25 and 50 million people, roughly half the population of the Byzantine Empire, and a significant portion of everyone alive in Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa at the time. Some researchers believe it killed as many as 1 in 4 people on Earth. 1 in 4 people on Earth. And Justinian's dream died with them. The military campaigns in Italy, already expensive and difficult, became impossible to sustain as the tax base collapsed and the soldiers died. The reconquest of Spain stalled and then reversed. North Africa, retaken at such cost, began slipping away. Within a generation of Justinian's death in 565 AD, most of what he had reconquered was lost again, this time permanently. The Roman Empire would never be whole again. The medieval world, so different from the ancient one, was being born in the mass graves outside Constantinople's walls. A bacterium too small to see had accomplished what no army had managed. It had ended the ancient world. So what do we do with this knowledge? What does a plague that killed half the world 15 centuries ago tell us about the hantavirus making headlines today, or the next pandemic that epidemiologists are already quietly preparing for? The uncomfortable answer is that it tells us something we already know and consistently fail to act on. Pandemics are not anomalies. They are not once-in-a-century events that arrive without warning from nowhere. They are a recurring feature of human civilization, as old as the trade routes that connect us, as inevitable as the fact of connection itself. The grain ships that brought plague to Constantinople in 541 AD were doing exactly what grain ships were supposed to do: feeding a city, sustaining an empire, keeping the wheels of a civilization turning. Nobody loaded those ships intending to carry death. Nobody in the port districts of Alexandria, where the ships were loaded, understood what was happening in the rat populations living in the grain stores. The connectivity that made the Byzantine Empire great was the same connectivity that destroyed it. We are more connected now than Justinian could have imagined in his most ambitious dreams, which means we are more vulnerable too. The plague of Justinian is not a story about the distant past. It is a story about the price of civilization, about the fact that every network we build to connect ourselves, every trade route and shipping lane and flight path and internet cable, carries not only the goods and ideas and people we intend it to carry, but everything else as well: the wanted and the unwanted, the life-giving and the lethal. Justinian understood this in the end, sitting in his palace above the Bosphorus, watching his dream of a restored Rome dissolve into mass graves and empty streets and campaigns abandoned for lack of soldiers to fight them. He had wanted to restore the ancient world. Instead, he had presided over its final ending. And in the ruins of what he had tried to build, something new, something medieval, something different, something that would eventually become the world we live in, had begun quietly and without anyone's permission to grow. Before every pandemic, there was this one, and before this one, there will be another. The only question that has ever mattered is whether we are paying attention. The stories that history tries to forget are usually the ones most worth remembering. That is what this channel exists to do, to find the moments that shaped everything and bring them back into the light, because understanding where we have been is the only honest way of understanding where we are going. If that matters to you, this channel is worth subscribing to. The next story is already waiting.